To Kill a Mockingbird and Jim Crow Laws by Michaela Spradlin. The setting of To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee is in the town of Macomb, Alabama during the 1930s. To understand how Jim Crow laws and To Kill a Mockingbird relate, we need to understand the historical influences that helped shape the novel.
Listen, all you gals and boys, I'm just from Tuckahoe. I'm going to sing a little song. My name's Jim Crow. Wheel about and turn about and do just so. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow. I went down to the river.
In 1836, Jim Crow is born. He begins his strange career as a malicious minstrel caricature of a black man, created by a white man to amuse white audiences. Jim Crow would come to symbolize one of the most tragic eras of race relations in American history, a time deeply rooted in promise and contradiction. 1865, 4 million Americans, slaves simply because they were born black, were now free. But in little over a decade, that promise was gone, replaced by a rigid system of laws designed to keep blacks from experiencing any of their newly achieved rights. It would be known as the era of Jim Crow, the American form of racial apartheid.
It was argued, however, if just being free was enough to be entitled to the full privileges of citizenship. Citizenship was viewed more as a privilege than a right. Racism and discrimination were not eliminated by the 13th Amendment. White Southern men had lived with the belief that they had been given by God a religious superiority over African Americans. In summary, inequality, racism, segregation, and the repression of the African Americans, especially in the South, has a long historical tradition. From the 1880s to the 1960s, a majority of American states enforced Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws, under the pretense of separate but equal, subjected Southern blacks to a way of life inferior in every way to that of whites. Segregation laws demanded that whites and blacks be kept in separate schools, hospitals, buses, trains, theaters, and amusement parks. Often these facilities were significantly inferior to what was provided for the whites. It was not uncommon for an African American to be murdered or subjected to violence as a means of keeping the African Americans repressed. Jim Crow laws also included a set of unspoken rules that all Southern blacks and whites had to follow. For example, African Americans were not to look whites in the eyes. Another example was that African Americans could never dispute what a white person said. Stepping beyond the boundaries meant a loss to the limited freedom they had. The organized system of white power seemed as impenetrable as it was treacherous. Next are examples of how Jim Crow laws are evident in the book. One example is racial zoning. African Americans are restricted to keep their buildings and houses in designated areas defined by the whites. Calpurnia's church was located in the quarters outside the southern town limits, across the old sawmill tracks. Another example, if a black person rode in a car driven by a white person, the black person sat in the back seat or the back of a trunk. When Atticus gives Calpurnia a ride home, she was in the back seat. Never assert or even initiate that a white person is lying. On the stand, Tom Robinson does not accuse Mayella of lying. He says she's mistaken in her mind. Tom's steady answer to Mr. Gilmer questioning was repeatedly that Mayella was mistaken in her mind. Obviously, a black male could not offer his hand or any other part of his body to a white woman because he risked of being accused of rape. During the trial, Tom Robinson states, it weren't safe for any nigger to be in a fix like that, referring to being alone in a room with Mayella, let alone caught by Mr. Yule when Mayella was hugging and kissing him.
God's gonna set this world on fire, yeah. yes, 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 God's gonna set this world on fire one of these days. Hallelujah, God's gonna set this world on fire. God's gonna set this world on fire one of these days. I'm gonna sit at the welcome table, yes, 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 I'm gonna sit at the welcome table one of these days. Hallelujah, I'm gonna sit at the welcome table. I'm gonna sit at the welcome table one of these days. God's gonna set this world on fire, yes, 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 God's gonna set this world on fire one of these days. Hallelujah, God's gonna set this world on fire. God's gonna set this world